On a bright and calm Tuesday morning, Officer Mike Williams started his patrol, just like any other day. His cruiser's engine hummed softly as he cruised through the familiar streets of the suburban town he had worked in for over a decade. As he passed by the houses, he waved to the people who recognized him, a warm smile on his face. Life as a police officer in a peaceful neighborhood was usually uneventful, but every now and then, something unexpected would happen that would change everything. Officer Williams had been on duty for a few hours when he noticed a car speeding through the residential area. It wasn't the first time someone had rushed down that road, but today something about the car caught his attention. It was moving too fast for a neighborhood like this, where children played outside, and people took their time. His years of experience told him that the driver was in a hurry, but he had no idea just how important this stop would become. He flicked on the sirens, signaling for the car to pull over. His hands moved instinctively as he reached for his ticket book, preparing for the usual routine. The car slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, just as he had expected. Officer Williams had done this 100 times, but today there was a slight feeling in his gut, something he couldn't quite place. As he stepped out of his cruiser, he checked the car's make and model quickly. It was a mid-sized sedan, a vehicle that didn't stand out much. But as he approached, he noticed the driver, a woman in her mid-30s with a calm expression. She rolled down the window when he reached the driver's side, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice calm and friendly. Officer Williams nodded, glancing down at the registration in his hand as he prepared to ask for her license and insurance. But before he could speak, he realized he recognized her. She wasn't just another driver. She was a nurse, Sarah Miller. She had been on the local news recently for her outstanding work at the hospital. Williams had seen her face in the headlines multiple times, and he admired her dedication to helping others. "Good morning, Ms. Miller," Officer Williams said, his tone softer now, recognizing her name. Sarah nodded politely, and a brief moment of small talk followed. She seemed perfectly calm, no signs of being nervous about the speeding ticket. "Can I see your license and registration, please?" he asked, sticking to the usual routine. Sarah handed them over without hesitation. As Officer Williams took a quick glance at the paperwork, he noticed something in the passenger seat. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then his eyes locked onto the figure sitting beside Sarah, a teenage boy, about 16 years old. The boy had messy brown hair, a look of surprise on his face. For a moment, he looked like he had seen a ghost. Officer Williams blinked in disbelief. The boy wasn't just anyone. He was his son, Ethan. A wave of confusion and shock washed over Officer Williams as he stared at his own son sitting in the passenger seat of this woman's car. The unexpectedness of the situation caught him completely off guard. Ethan, his only son, was in the car with Sarah, a nurse he barely knew. Why was he with her? Why hadn't Ethan told him he was going anywhere? The questions flooded his mind, and a knot tightened in his stomach. For a brief moment, everything around him seemed to slow down. Officer Williams stood there, frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. He had been a police officer for years, handling countless traffic stops, but this was different. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was something personal, and it was about to change everything. Officer Williams stood still for a moment, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. There, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, was his son, Ethan. The shock on his face was clear, but it wasn't just because he had caught his son in someone else's car. It was because Ethan had never mentioned anything about needing a ride, especially from a woman he didn't know well. This wasn't a small thing. This was his son, and something wasn't right. Ethan's eyes met his father's for a brief second, and in that moment, it was as if the world around them had disappeared. Officer Williams had been a father for over 16 years, and he knew his son better than anyone. Yet this moment felt strange. Ethan wasn't acting like himself. The way he avoided eye contact told his father something was off. The officer's heart began to race. What was Ethan doing in this car? Why hadn't he said anything about needing a ride? Why hadn't he told his dad? Officer Williams was so used to seeing his son in the kitchen, sitting at the dinner table, or playing video games in the living room. He never imagined he'd see him here, in this situation, in a car with a woman he didn't know. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Officer Williams knew he had to stay professional. This was still a traffic stop, and he still had a job to do. But his thoughts kept coming back to Ethan. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah's voice broke the silence. It was calm, but there was a slight nervousness in her tone. She was the one driving, after all, but it was clear that this unexpected stop was now putting her in an uncomfortable situation. Officer Williams snapped back to reality. He hadn't spoken for a few moments, and now he needed to address what was happening. "Sorry," he said, clearing his throat. "I recognize your passenger. He's my son, Ethan." His voice was steady, though the surprise lingered beneath the surface. Sarah's eyes widened slightly in recognition. She had likely heard about Officer Williams, too, since he was well known in the area. But her expression quickly shifted to concern, and she looked at Ethan, who was staring out the window, refusing to meet his father's gaze. "Ethan?" Officer Williams asked, trying to keep his voice neutral but feeling the tension in his chest. He didn't want to accuse, but he needed to know what was going on. Ethan slowly turned his head toward his father. The look on his face was a mixture of embarrassment and guilt, and it made the officer's heart ache. Ethan opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, clearly struggling with how to explain himself. "Dad, I didn't want you to worry," Ethan mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a small confession, but it carried so much weight. Officer Williams felt a pang in his chest. He had always encouraged Ethan to be open and honest with him, to talk about whatever was on his mind. But here, in this moment, his son was keeping something back, something important. Sarah, sensing the growing tension, spoke up again. "Ethan asked me for a ride home from school today. He said his car had broken down." Her voice was kind, but there was a slight hesitation, as though she wasn't sure how much to reveal. "He didn't want to bother anyone, so he came to me for help. I didn't realize there was any problem." Officer Williams looked at Sarah, then back at his son. He had to admit, her explanation seemed plausible. It wasn't unusual for someone to ask for help when their car broke down, but why had Ethan not told him about it? Why hadn't he mentioned anything when he got home from school? Officer Williams could feel the frustration building, but he knew he had to keep it together. "Ethan," the officer began, his voice softer now, "why didn't you tell me you were having car trouble? Why didn't you ask for my help?" Ethan lowered his gaze again, avoiding his father's eyes. The silence between them felt heavy, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't want you to think I was making excuses," Ethan finally said, his voice barely audible. "I've been having a tough time at school, Dad. I didn't want to add more to your plate." The officer's heart softened as he listened to his son's words. Ethan had been hiding his struggles that Officer Williams had no idea about. Schoolwork, pressures from friends, and the weight of expectations had been quietly building inside his son. Officer Williams hadn't noticed because he had been so caught up in his work. In that moment, it hit him hard. His son wasn't just a teenager going through the usual growing pains. He was carrying a lot more on his shoulders than his father had realized. Officer Williams felt a mix of emotions flooding through him. He had always prided himself on being a good father, someone Ethan could come to with any problem, big or small. Yet here he was, standing beside the car, learning that his son had been struggling with something he hadn't known about. The shock of seeing Ethan in the car with Sarah had left him momentarily speechless, but the conversation was starting to make him realize just how much he had missed. Ethan, still avoiding eye contact, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and his gaze stayed fixed on the ground. Officer Williams could see that his son wasn't trying to make excuses. Ethan had always been a good kid, honest in his own way, but this was different. It wasn't like the usual minor issues teenagers sometimes hid. There was something deeper, something that Ethan hadn't wanted to admit even to himself. "Ethan," Officer Williams said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "You don't have to hide things from me. You know that, right? We're supposed to talk about stuff, good or bad." His words hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan slowly looked up. The look in his eyes wasn't that of a rebellious teenager, but of someone who felt overwhelmed by everything around him. "I know, Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "But I didn't want to make things harder for you. I thought if I could just handle it myself, it would be easier." Officer Williams could feel his heart soften at his son's words. It was clear now that Ethan had been bottling up his feelings, trying to take on more than he could handle. The pressures of school, of trying to live up to expectations, and perhaps even the weight of being the son of a police officer. Ethan had been carrying all of that without asking for help. Officer Williams had seen the signs in his son's face over the past few weeks, but he had been so focused on his work that he hadn't picked up on how much his son was struggling. The officer took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. This was a moment he hadn't expected, but it was one he knew he couldn't let slip away. He needed to reach his son, to let him know that it was okay to lean on him. That's what parents were for, right? To be there when their children needed them the most. "Ethan," Officer Williams said gently, "life can be tough sometimes. We all have our struggles, but you don't have to carry everything on your own. You're not alone in this. I'm your father, and I'm always here for you, no matter what." Ethan's eyes welled up with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. The last thing he wanted was for his dad to see him cry. Yet, something inside him broke at his father's words. The weight he had been carrying for so long suddenly felt lighter, just by hearing those simple words of reassurance. He had always known his father loved him, but hearing it in that moment, when things felt so uncertain, made all the difference. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have told you. I didn't mean to worry you." "I'm not angry," Officer Williams said, his voice firm but full of understanding. "I'm just worried about you, son. I want to help you, but you've got to let me in. You've got to trust me enough to share what's going on. We'll figure it out together, okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, still unsure of how to fully express everything he had been feeling. But just hearing his father's words, hearing him say that they could face this together, was enough to make him feel a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel like he was alone in his struggles. Meanwhile, Sarah, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, felt a mix of relief and sadness. She hadn't known about the tensions Ethan had been facing at home. She had only known him as the kind, polite teenager who came to the hospital for a visit, always with a smile on his face. But now, seeing the way he opened up to his father, she realized that there was much more to Ethan than she had realized. She felt a deep sense of respect for the young man sitting beside her. "I'm sorry, officer," Sarah said quietly, speaking up now that the tension seemed to ease. "I didn't mean to cause any problems. I was just trying to help Ethan. He seemed like he needed someone to talk to, and I didn't want him to feel alone." Officer Williams looked at her with appreciation. He could see the sincerity in her eyes. She had tried to help Ethan without any ill intentions, and in that moment, he felt grateful for her kindness. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his tone softened. "I appreciate you looking out for him." Ethan glanced at Sarah, his expression less tense now. "Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate the ride." She smiled, nodding. "No problem. I'm glad I could help." The officer stood for a moment, processing everything that had happened. It was still strange to see his son in a situation like this, but at least now he understood. The truth had finally come out, and he felt a sense of relief as well. He wasn't angry, he was just worried. And now that Ethan had opened up, He knew they could face whatever was coming next together. The tension in the air began to fade as Ethan and his father stood there, both of them processing everything that had just been said. For a brief moment, the officer just looked at his son, taking in the way Ethan seemed to shrink into the car seat. His son, the boy who had always seemed so strong, was now vulnerable. It was clear that the weight of his struggles had taken a toll on him, but now that the truth was out, Officer Williams knew he had to do his part to help his son heal. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Instead, it was a chance for both father and son to reflect on what had just happened. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat again, his fingers gripping the edge of the seat as if he were still trying to find the right words to say. His eyes kept flickering toward his father, but it was clear that the boy was still unsure about fully opening up. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words, not after months of keeping everything bottled up inside. Officer Williams sighed and glanced at Sarah, who had been watching the interaction quietly. He knew it wasn't her responsibility to get involved in family matters, but she had been kind enough to help his son, even when he hadn't known what Ethan had been going through. Her quiet presence had actually made the situation easier to handle. He felt a sense of gratitude toward her, especially knowing how hard it must have been for her to witness a father and son having such an emotional conversation. "Sarah," Officer Williams said, breaking the silence, "I really appreciate you taking the time to help Ethan. I know this situation isn't easy for any of us, but I'm glad you were there for him when he needed it." Sarah gave him a soft smile, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood the deeper emotions in the room. "I just wanted to help. Ethan seemed like he needed someone to talk to, and I didn't want him to feel alone." She paused for a moment, then added, "Sometimes just being there for someone is the most important thing you can do." Her words struck a chord with Officer Williams. He knew that Ethan had been feeling isolated, but it wasn't just about his son needing help from others. It was about him needing help from his father, too. He realized that as a police officer, he had been so focused on his work, constantly putting in long hours and dealing with emergencies, that he had failed to notice the subtle signs of his son's struggles. He hadn't recognized the stress Ethan was dealing with at school, and he hadn't noticed how hard it had been for him to ask for help. He looked at his son again, this time with more understanding in his eyes. "Ethan," Officer Williams said gently, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm here for you. You don't have to carry everything by yourself, and you don't have to hide things from me. I'm not just your dad. I'm your support, and that means I'll be there for you through whatever comes our way." Ethan finally met his father's eyes, his expression softening. There was something different in the way he looked at him now, less afraid, more willing to trust. It wasn't easy for Ethan to open up, but hearing his dad say those words made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could start letting go of some of the weight he had been carrying. "I'll try, Dad," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I know I should have told you earlier, but I was just trying to figure it out on my own." His voice cracked slightly, as if the floodgates were beginning to open. "I didn't want to disappoint you." Officer Williams shook his head, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You could never disappoint me, son. I just want you to be happy and healthy. That's all I've ever wanted. You don't have to go through this alone. We'll face it together, okay?" Ethan nodded, his eyes welling up with tears once again. But this time, he didn't try to hide them. He didn't need to be strong all the time. His father had just given him permission to be vulnerable, to be human. It was more than Ethan could have asked for in that moment. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. As Sarah watched the two of them, she felt a quiet sense of relief. She had witnessed something powerful, a father and son reconnecting in a way that was both emotional and healing. She knew that their relationship wouldn't be magically fixed overnight, but this moment was a start toward healing, toward understanding, and toward rebuilding the bond they shared. "I think I'll head out now," Sarah said softly, her voice gentle. "You two have a lot to talk about. I'm just glad I could be there for him today." "Thank you, Sarah," Officer Williams said with a sincere smile. "I really appreciate everything you did for him." As Officer Williams and Ethan drove home, the quiet hum of the car filled the space between them. The air felt lighter now, less heavy with the unspoken words that had hung between them earlier. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his lap, still processing everything that had happened. He had never imagined that one day he would find himself having such a serious conversation with his dad in the middle of a traffic stop, but something had shifted in that moment. The drive home seemed to take longer than usual, but neither of them rushed. The streets, once so familiar, now felt different, as if the events of the day had somehow changed the way they saw everything. Officer Williams stole glances at his son every now and then, seeing the thoughtful look on his face. Ethan wasn't the same child he had been when Officer Williams first became a father. He was growing up, facing his own challenges, and it was becoming clearer than ever that he needed support, something the officer was more than willing to give. Ethan, on the other hand, was reflecting on everything his father had said. The reassurance, the love, the understanding. He didn't realize how much he had needed to hear those words until they were spoken. For so long, he had been trying to deal with everything on his own, convinced that he needed to handle his problems alone. But now he saw things differently. His dad had always been there for him, even if he hadn't recognized it before. And now, Ethan was beginning to understand that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a way of showing strength, of facing the challenges of life with the support of those who cared about you. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Officer Williams turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking at his son. "We don't have to talk about everything tonight, Ethan," he said gently. "But we can start. I want you to know that you can always come to me when you're ready. We're in this together." Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting his dad's for the first time with a sense of openness. "Thanks, Dad. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that," he said quietly, his voice more steady now. They both got out of the car and walked inside together, the house feeling warm and welcoming. The smell of dinner lingered in the air, and for a moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. But even though the atmosphere had lightened, there was still a lot to be addressed. It wasn't just about this conversation. They had to build trust, rebuild their connection, and find new ways to communicate. As they sat down at the kitchen table, Officer Williams could see the weight that had been on his son's shoulders slowly begin to lift. He wasn't completely free from his struggles, but the first step toward healing had been taken. For Ethan, that meant opening up, even just a little, and letting his father in. For Officer Williams, it meant recognizing that his son wasn't just growing up physically, but emotionally too. And as much as Ethan needed guidance, he needed understanding just as much. The officer reached for the salt and pepper, giving his son a chance to speak if he wanted to. Ethan took a deep breath before he started, the words flowing a little easier now. "Dad, I've been feeling a lot of pressure lately. Not just from school, but from a lot of things. I didn't know how to talk about it, and I didn't want to disappoint you." Officer Williams listened intently, his heart softening as Ethan spoke. He had known there were struggles, but now he was hearing the depth of his son's feelings. The officer gently set down the pepper shaker and looked at Ethan. "I'm glad you're talking to me now, son. I know it hasn't been easy, but we'll figure it out. Whatever it is, we can work through it together." Ethan's face brightened slightly at his dad's words. He felt lighter, not because everything was solved, but because he knew he didn't have to face it alone anymore. He hadn't expected to find comfort in such a simple conversation, but it was exactly what he needed. "I think I've been afraid," Ethan continued, his voice gaining a little more strength. "Afraid that I wouldn't measure up to what you expect from me. I know you work hard, and sometimes I feel like I should be perfect, like I should have everything together. But it's not always that easy." Officer Williams smiled gently, a knowing look in his eyes. "Son, I don't expect you to be perfect. I never have. I just want you to be your best, whatever that looks like. We all have our own pace, and it's okay to not have everything figured out right now. What matters is that you're trying, and that's enough. Ethan felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off his shoulders. His father's words echoed in his mind. He didn't have to be perfect. It was okay to struggle, to not have all the answers. As long as he kept trying, that was what mattered. The following days passed by more peacefully than Officer Williams had expected. The tension that had been hanging over their home seemed to have lifted, replaced by an unspoken understanding between father and son. There were still moments of silence, of course, but they weren't awkward anymore. They had started talking more. Little conversations here and there about school, about life, and sometimes even about their favorite shows or sports. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and both of them were learning to appreciate it. One evening, after a long day at work, Officer Williams came home to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with his books spread out in front of him. The boy was busy studying, but he looked up and gave his father a smile as he walked in. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, his voice sounding more relaxed than it had in weeks. "How was your day?" The officer paused for a moment, surprised at the simple, casual question. It was just a small thing, but to him, it meant a lot. It meant that his son was looking at him as more than just a police officer. He was looking at him as a dad again. "It was fine, son," Officer Williams replied, setting down his things and taking the seat across from Ethan. "Busy, like usual. How about you? How's school going?" Ethan shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's okay. Just a lot of work. But I'm getting through it." He paused for a moment, looking down at his books before glancing up at his dad. "I think I've been managing things better since we talked. I'm not so stressed out anymore." Officer Williams felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was small, but it was a start. It was exactly what he had hoped for, a sign that his son was learning to handle things, that he was feeling less overwhelmed. Of course, he knew there was still a long way to go, but this was a positive step forward. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," Officer Williams said, his voice full of sincerity. "I know you've been going through a lot, but you've handled it better than I expected. Just remember, I'm always here for you, no matter what." Ethan looked at his dad, his expression softening. "Thanks, Dad. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I think I'm finally realizing that I don't have to do everything on my own. I can talk to you about things when I need to. I guess I'm just used to keeping things to myself." Officer Williams nodded, understanding. "I get it. It's not always easy to ask for help, especially when you're used to being independent. But you don't have to carry everything alone. It's okay to lean on others, especially when it's tough." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, not one filled with tension or uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that comes after understanding has been reached, when the air feels lighter and easier to breathe. A few minutes later, Ethan pushed his books aside and stood up. "I'm gonna go for a walk," he said. "Clear my head a bit." Officer Williams looked up at him, nodding. "All right. Be careful, okay?" "I will, Dad." "Thanks," Ethan replied, grabbing his jacket before heading out the door. As Officer Williams watched him leave, a feeling of pride filled his chest. He had always known that Ethan was strong, but seeing his son handle the pressure of life with more maturity gave him a sense of hope. Maybe things weren't perfect yet, but they were getting there, and that was all that mattered. Later that evening, as the officer sat on the couch, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few days ago, he had felt distant from his son, unsure of how to help him through his struggles. But now, things felt different. They had connected in a way they hadn't in a long time. The honesty between them, the vulnerability, had opened a door to a deeper understanding. They weren't just father and son anymore. They were two people who could rely on each other, two people who could talk openly about their lives. The relationship between them wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was something Officer Williams hadn't realized he had been missing. The truth was, he had been so focused on protecting his family, keeping them safe, that he had forgotten what it meant to be truly present with them. But now, with Ethan, he was starting to make up for lost time. When Ethan came back from his walk later that night, he seemed a little calmer, more at peace with himself. He didn't say much, but his presence was enough to reassure Officer Williams that things were improving. They didn't need to have deep conversations every day. Sometimes, just being there for each other was enough. The days that followed seemed brighter. Officer Williams and Ethan had built a new kind of rhythm in their household, one that allowed them both to breathe a little easier. While things hadn't magically become perfect, the air felt lighter, and the tension that had once been so thick between them had started to dissolve. They were learning how to communicate, how to be there for each other without needing everything to be fixed right away. One Saturday morning, Officer Williams woke up early, as usual, to prepare for his shift. He had grown accustomed to the quiet hours of the morning, the house still dark, the only sounds being the hum of the coffee maker and the soft ticking of the clock. But that morning, something was different. As he made his way into the kitchen, he noticed Ethan sitting at the table, a bowl of cereal in front of him, his school books open. The light from the kitchen window cast a warm glow over his son, and for a moment, the officer just stood there, watching Ethan. Ethan didn't notice his father standing in the doorway right away. He was focused on the math problems in front of him, scribbling notes and trying to work through the equations. It was a small moment, but it meant something to Officer Williams. His son, once distant and closed off, now seemed focused and determined. It wasn't just about schoolwork. It was about how Ethan was approaching life. He had become more patient, more willing to face challenges without getting overwhelmed. "Morning, son," Officer Williams finally said, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up, startled at first, then gave his dad a small smile. "Hey, Dad, I didn't wake you, did I?" "No, not at all," Officer Williams replied, walking over to pour himself a cup of coffee. "I'm just getting ready for work. But I see you're up early. That's new." Ethan shrugged, a bit sheepish. "Yeah, I figured I'd get a head start on my homework. I've been trying to stay on top of things lately. Don't want to fall behind again." Officer Williams felt a surge of pride. He had always known his son was smart, but seeing Ethan take responsibility for his schoolwork without the usual stress and frustration was a big step. It was a sign that Ethan was growing, not just physically, but emotionally. The boy who had once kept everything bottled up inside now seemed more open, more willing to face challenges with a sense of determination. "Well, I'm proud of you," Officer Williams said, taking the sip of his coffee. "It's not easy to stay on top of everything, but you're doing it. Keep it up." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him at his father's words. "Thanks, Dad. I'm trying." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not having to do everything on my own. It's been helping. I'm not so stressed anymore." The officer nodded, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I'm glad to hear that, Ethan. But remember, it's okay to ask for help when you need it. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. Not anymore." Ethan's expression softened, and for the first time in a long time, he truly believed those words. He had spent so much time thinking he needed to handle everything alone, whether it was school, his friends, or his own emotions. But now, thanks to the conversations he'd had with his father, he knew he didn't have to. There were people in his life who cared about him, who wanted to help, and that was enough. As the morning wore on, the two of them continued talking, sharing small moments that felt significant. Officer Williams asked Ethan about his plans for the weekend, and they joked about the upcoming school dance. It wasn't deep conversation, but it was the kind of conversation that built a bridge between them, a bridge that was stronger than it had ever been before. When it was time for Officer Williams to leave for work, he gave his son a brief hug before heading out the door. "Take care of yourself today, Ethan. And don't forget, if you need anything, just let me know." Ethan nodded, his voice steady and sure. "I will, Dad. Have a good day at work." As Officer Williams drove off to his shift, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Just a few weeks ago, things had been tense and strained between them. But now, it felt like they were finding their way back to each other. They weren't perfect, and they hadn't solved every problem. But they had made real progress. And for the first time in a long time, Officer Williams felt like they were moving in the right direction. As for Ethan, he had learned that it was okay to not have all the answers. It was okay to ask for help. And most importantly, he had learned that he didn't have to face the challenges of life alone. His dad would always be there, offering support, understanding, and love, no matter what. Weeks passed, and the changes between Officer Williams and Ethan continued to unfold. Their relationship, once strained and distant, had slowly transformed into something stronger and more understanding. They found themselves having more conversations, both big and small, about everything from schoolwork to personal goals and dreams. There were still challenges, of course, but they were beginning to face them together, side by side. One evening, as Officer Williams returned from his shift, he walked into the house to find Ethan sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to a book. The house was quiet, a familiar and comforting silence. Ethan glanced up as his dad entered, offering a brief smile. It wasn't just a simple greeting. It was a smile that spoke of their growing bond, a smile that showed the quiet confidence Ethan now had. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, setting the book aside. "How was your day?" "Busy as always," Officer Williams replied, taking off his shoes and sitting down beside him. "But it's good to be home. What are you reading?" Ethan shrugged. "Just some book for school. Not the most exciting, but I'm getting through it." He paused for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. You know, about what we talked about." Officer Williams raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked down at the book in his hands, fiddling with the corners. "Well, I guess I've been thinking about what you said, how it's okay to not have everything figured out, how it's okay to ask for help. I've realized something. I don't need to try and do everything on my own. I mean, I still want to be responsible, but it's not like I have to carry everything all by myself. It's a lot easier to handle when I talk to you about it." The officer smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had hoped for moments like this. Moments when his son could openly admit the struggles he faced and realize that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a strength. "I'm really proud of you, Ethan," Officer Williams said softly. "You're learning to let go of the idea that you have to do everything on your own, and that's a huge step. And no matter what, I'll always be here to support you. You don't have to carry that burden alone." Ethan's eyes brightened at his father's words. For the first time in a long time, he truly felt the weight of his emotions lift. He had spent so much time feeling like he needed to be perfect, that he needed to keep up with everyone's expectations, but now he understood that his dad wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking for honesty, for connection. And that meant everything. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I'm trying to be better about it. I've learned a lot over the past few weeks, and I know I'm not alone in this. I've got you, and I've got myself too." The officer felt a warm sense of relief, knowing that his son was learning to take control of his own emotions while also relying on the support of others. They had been through a lot together, but this moment felt like a turning point. It was proof that the hard work and honest conversations were making a difference. The two of them spent the rest of the evening together, watching TV and laughing at some silly show they both enjoyed. The simplicity of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. It was the kind of night they had missed, the kind of night that felt like family. And for both father and son, it was a reminder of how far they had come. As the night drew to a close and Officer Williams headed to bed, he paused for a moment, looking back at Ethan. His son was already in bed, reading quietly, But there was something different about the way he was sitting. It wasn't just the physical change, it was the emotional change. Ethan was no longer the quiet, closed-off teenager he had been. He was becoming someone who understood the importance of connection, of vulnerability, and of asking for help when needed. The officer lay down in his own bed, reflecting on the journey they had both been on. There had been difficult moments, moments of frustration and uncertainty, but there had also been breakthroughs, moments when they truly understood each other. And those moments were what mattered the most. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there for each other, no matter the circumstances. The next morning, as Officer Williams prepared for his shift again, he found Ethan already awake, getting ready for his own day. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes. The relationship between them was no longer just about father and son. It was about two people who cared deeply for each other and who had learned to communicate with honesty and trust. Before he left for work, Officer Williams placed a hand on his son's shoulder, offering a smile. "Remember, I'm always here if you need anything, Ethan."